you get to another kind of philosophy called existentialism, which essentially states, yeah, sure, there might not be any purpose in this world, but I sure can make one up. A big proponent of this, or a big case study of existentialism, is actually a writer called Albert Camus. He wrote a book called The Myth of Sisyphus. If you don't know what Sisyphus is, it's a story of a being who is put into a rather interesting eternal torture by the gods. What ends up happening is he is fated to roll a giant rock up a hill, only to see that rock roll down, and then he has to repeat the process for an eternity, right? So this is the myth, right? And the guy's name is Sisyphus. So what Albert Camus does is, what if we were to see all of life in this kind of way? That it's just us doing repetitive tasks over and over and over and over again without cease, and then one day we just die. If this is the kind of meaningless, purposeless life that we live in, the question he asks is, should we just all commit suicide? That's the provocative question that he asks in his book. Of course, that's not the answer that he ultimately wants us to take. It's a very grim and dark answer. Rather, what he suggests is that Sisyphus is actually happy doing what he does. And the reason why he argues that is, as he's rolling the rock up, he has no time to think about his circumstances. But when that rock is going down the hill, he can think about his circumstances and he can start constructing a reality for himself. The reality for Albert Camus is, if you commit suicide, what you're doing is you're letting the game of life win. But if you live as hard as you can, doesn't matter what the quality of that life is, you're beating the system. I have a lot of friends who are atheists who actually kind of like this idea. They gravitate towards it. I'm just not quite convinced that it's the best outlook on life. It's a very brutish and very harsh outlook that requires you to just live for the sake of living. But because of this, actually, what ends up happening is existentialism becomes a very big reality in our youth. There is no inherent thing out there that can tell us for certain what is or is not why I should live. Therefore, what makes me want to live can only be developed in myself, right? I have to find my truth in the world. Sometimes kids say, they'll qualify what they say, especially when it's like a moral argument that they're about to present. They'll say, well, my truth is, right? So it's playing on this idea of, I have my truth, you have your truth. We're just all in it together to find our own individual truths, because we all know in reality that there is no objective universal truth. What has changed, though, is people have started to say, maybe it's not just about what I find to be my truth, but it's finding my truth in our truth. What that means is no one really goes about talking about finding truth by themselves as individuals anymore. It's all about finding the right communities, finding the right places where we belong, and those communities' truths and standards become our standards for truth and reality, right? So the church is just one example of this, but we have a bunch of other institutions, just even the places that you work, the schools that you go to, the clubs that your kids are in, extracurricular activities. All of these are little, small, tightly knit communities of truth that kind of dictate and shape our children and our youth into forming the kind of identities that they all currently possess and And I think this is really important, especially as we recognize going forward that we live in a constantly globalizing world, and that it's a world that keeps pressuring us into a situation where we can only believe that pluralism must be true, that everything is equal in opinion, everything is as accessible as anything else, and can we really be certain that anything is true, other than what I find in my community? So let's go ahead and watch this video. So for this session and also the next session, we're going to watch a lot of YouTube videos. Why? Because that's partly how your children communicate through YouTube. But let's go ahead and watch this. This is a lady who is talking about how to form identity in the world that we live in. So let's just
Sometimes it feels like life's biggest mystery is finding out who you are. And because we're constantly learning and growing and changing, there's always a new you to discover. Again and again and again. But in a society of limitless choice, it can be really difficult to find your thing. We're in a world of constant creation, new trends, new styles, new looks. How do we keep up? How do we find what best represents who we are and show that to the world? Because how we look at ourselves in the mirror should reflect how we truly feel on the inside. Also, thank you to SK2 for sponsoring today's episode. And for years, I feel like I've struggled with, what is my style? Because there's this very valid idea that how you present yourself stylistically says a lot about who you are as a person internally. And I have gone through the rigmarole of looks. And sometimes it seems like my friends know who they are way better than I ever will know myself. Like my friend Auden always has a daily uniform. She's in a jumpsuit, comfortable boots, with her signature Daria deadpan glare. My friend Dodie seems like she was just born in knee-high socks and adorable dresses. And my friend Savannah somehow manages to make this whole plain tees tucked into high-waisted jeans look both sophisticated, simple, and very Steve Jobs. Whereas me, I feel like I kind of dress up as a different character every day depending on my mood. I can't make up my mind on what my style is more than I can decide on what my favorite food is or my favorite TV shows are. I feel like I'm just constantly in flux, not quite settled into who I am. And for a long time, that's made me feel bad. Like I never quite quit being the new kid. And it's only recently that I have started to finally embrace this about myself. And when I think about it, I'm like, yeah, you grew up every 2 years, moving to different places and trying on different aspects of your personality. So why wouldn't that continue as an adult? And I'm an actor, so why wouldn't I love playing dress up every day and discovering new characters? Maybe a huge part of who I am is that I'm always changing, and that's okay. Because I used to feel this immense pressure that I had to define myself in this one way. But that definition is probably gonna change over time. What about you? Do you have a certain style? Do you feel like you need to have a style? Because when I was emo, I wanted everyone to know I was emo. More eyeliner. And whenever I went through a big mental change, I felt like I needed to mirror that with a physical change just as drastic. Less hair. Or do you feel more comfortable with who you are and what you look like being sort of more in flux and going with the flow? Do you not think at all about what your style means or put any effort into it? Because I think that says something about you too. I don't know, I just find all of that really fascinating, and I'd be very curious to hear what your approach is. As I mentioned earlier, today's episode is sponsored by SK2. So throughout the changes you make to find and keep up with your authentic self, don't forget to take care of the foundation of what's underneath, your skin. I was surprised to find out that in America, essences are a relatively unknown product. Do you know what an essence is? Because they've been widely used in Asian countries forever. If you don't know, basically it's a skincare product that has this watery consistency, and it's used after cleansing and toning, but prior to serums or moisturizers. It's an essential step to hydrate and prime your skin to deeply absorb all of the ingredients you're putting on your face. So SK2's facial treatment essence has an active ingredient called Pitira, which, fun story, was actually discovered at a sake brewery in Japan. So scientists noticed that the workers, though they were old and had wrinkly faces, had these super soft and youthful hands. So Pitira, which was derived from this natural fermentation process and made all of these beautiful baby hands, is now essential for our faces. And it works so well because its properties are actually very similar to the formula of human skin. I love this stuff. It makes my skin so much more hydrated and smooth and radiant, and I feel so much more comfortable not wearing foundation because finally my skin tone's even. To find out more about SK2's facial treatment essence, you can click on the link below. I'm Anna Akana. Stay awesome, Gotham.
Okay, so what can we learn from that? I just love the product placement. It's just so part of the culture. But in terms of what we can learn about what she's saying about identity, there are a couple words that she said that I hope that you've been catching up on, right? For some of us, we kind of know our identity. It's about what's kind of in the inside, how we feel, and that's presented on the outside by what we wear, what we eat, what we do. But for a lot of us, we don't know. We change over time. We're always in flux. How do we really know who we are? We just got to try different things. One day I might dress like this, another day I might dress like that. But that's really what identity has become in our society. It's really about trying to portray to the rest of the world, or really for yourself, that inner feeling, right? That kind of mushy, not really defined feeling that you have. Now, what's really fascinating about what she says is there is kind of an expectation from our parents and also from kind of the communities that we live in to be in a very certain specific box identity, right? We have to be a very certain kind of way. And what ends up happening is that when we teach our youth, we end up ostracizing or pushing out youth who may not necessarily fit our preconceived boxes of what it means to be, quote unquote, a Christian. Oftentimes when I talk to our youth about what it means to be a Christian, I tell them that Christianity is really a journey, right? Because it plays right into their mentality that, their life is in flux. Their identity is always being challenged. There's always new doubts that creep in on whether or not I am truly a Christian or not even that, whether I'm an American or I'm Asian or I'm Chinese or Korean or whatever it may be. There's always these creeping doubts attacking their sense of identity, right? Because that's the kind of age that we live in. But as Christians, rather than state, this is what it means to be a Christian, right? I think it's better for us to say, what does the Bible, or how can we as a community come together around the Bible to look at it and to read it and to understand it, live our lives in such a way that it's constantly in dialogue with each other, expanding our perspectives, maybe even challenging what aren't really biblical boxes that we should be having. So I tell the kids that, if you get baptized, right, there's a certain level of commitment to it. But you also have to recognize that being baptized doesn't mean that you have your entire life together. It doesn't mean that you have your entire identity set before you. What it means is that you're starting this process and journey of being transformed into the person of Jesus. And that means that your identity will change. There is flux. Things will happen. But we're all eventually going to go to the same end of that journey. If we see this as a journey, as your kids very much see life as a journey, then it's easy to just tell them, yeah, Christianity is a journey too. We're all in for the ride, but we're all going somewhere. And it's the people who kind of present themselves as people who've already made it that are always seen with skepticism, right? So whether or not you agree with this, right, this is just kind of the mentality that we have to deal with. So this slide is called, Can Dead Philosophers Teach New Tricks? This is pretty important because in the Christian world, there has been a resurgence in looking at older philosophers. One philosopher in the West in particular, Aristotle. So Aristotle rises from the grave. There's a Catholic, Roman Catholic philosopher named Alasdair MacIntyre. He wrote a book called After Virtue, which basically talks about how like any discussion, any ethical, moral discussion we have is an absolute disaster because we've forgotten the reason why humans started talking about virtue, at least in the West to begin with. Even though he is Roman Catholic, his writing After Virtue has propagated and started to make headway into a lot of Protestant circles as well. But basically what Aristotle and these kind of like virtue ethicists state is that your identity and character are almost indistinguishable, right? Who you are as a person, your character, it's hard to say like what the difference between that and your identity is. Even to the point where someone might even say that your identity and your character are exactly the same. Regardless of the debate, the philosophical debate in that, what is important is that if there is a connection, if there is a correlation between your identity and your character, what Aristotle and Alistair McIntyre, James K. Smith, and all of these other people are saying in the Christian world is that your habits, what you do, are extremely important. Because the way that you develop your character, the way that you develop your identity is through either good or bad habits. And habits are just things that you do, right? Things that come to you second nature. I mean, even just think about that phrase, second nature, because you're applying a nature on your first nature, right? By doing habits. That's where that language comes from. So what we see is that if you do things that are good according to what you think the good life looks like, that's what we call a virtue. And if you do things that are bad against what the good life looks like, then those are called vices. If you know anything about church history, the church has a very long history of talking about this, forming virtues and denying vices. And the most important thing that I want us to kind of get from this is that character requires a vision for the good life. Every ethical choice that you make, good or bad, is always deep down rooted in your imagination for what a good life looks like. The reason why you don't steal is because you have an imagination of what a world where people don't steal looks like, and it's something that you want. Right? So character requires a vision for the good life and a community who stabilizes it. Right? We need communities to kind of give that external pressure to help remind us that this is the vision that we want to live out. And we'll kind of get to that when we talk about video games and peer pressure. So we also see this in the Bible, the connection between habits and character, right? In Luke 6:43, it says, "No good tree bears bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit," right? Your identity, good tree, bad tree. What you do, bad fruit, good fruit, right? There's this intimate connection in the Bible that recognizes that what we do is essential to who we are. Also in James 1:22-25, this is kind of the paradox of people who don't live according to who they should be, right, or who they are. "But be sure you live out the message and do not merely listen to it and so deceive yourselves. For if someone merely listens to the message and does not live it out, he's like someone who gazes at his own face in a mirror. For he gazes at himself and then goes out and immediately forgets what sort of person he was." Right? Someone who says that they're a Christian, thinks that they're a Christian, but doesn't actually do what Christians do, have habits of Christians, is like someone who looks at himself and then forgets who he is. That's what James says. So the Bible often links our identity with what we do. And I think the world recognizes this as well, especially with the girl that we just watched, right? What you wear, what you eat, what activities you do on a day-to-day basis. These things form your identity, but they also express who you are as a person. So let's kind of go into our case study. I call this Salvation Through Video Games, because when we talk about video games and video game addiction, I think this is what we need to say first, right? I think it's very easy for us who have not really grown up with video games to kind of push it aside because it's weird or it's different or we see kind of all the negative aspects of it. And it's very hard to perceive, actually, without playing yourself, all the benefits that video games might have, right? If you watch your kids play, the first thought is not, wow, they have so much skill. Like, what in the world is this, right? What I want to do then is to kind of frame video games in this kind of way. To think of video games not as necessarily bad things, but video game addiction as a bad thing. And that video games, even though they are good, are often entered into because it is a form of escapism. Your kids are trying to escape something, right? Video games are also a great way to pick a vision that you want to live in this life, in a world that is pluralistic, where you can you can have as many different options as you want in terms of what you want life to be like, and you can also choose what you want life to be like. Video games are the best place to go to do that, right? Because there's a video game for almost anything. You want to be a cook? You have a video game for that. You want to be a surgeon? You have a video game for that. You want to fight in a war? You have many video games for that. But that's the point of video games, is that this technology has allowed for pluralism to be rampant. You can choose who you want to be. And video games are a way for us to form communities, believe it or not. We often think that our kids are just kind of by themselves, never really talking to friends, but video games are actually the locus. It's where they come together to be friends, right? This is the activity that they do. And past generations, it might have been to pick up a basketball, go outside on the streets and play with your friends. But now it's to form communities through video games. And to form communities not just with people who live on the same street as you, but people who may live halfway across the world who barely can speak even your own language, right? This is the kind of globalized world that we live in. But it's also a way to build habits, right? To build skill, to get good at a game, right? To do objectives. It's a way to be recognized by the community that you're in. Even though your family doesn't recognize you, that you'll always be a A- student and not an A+ student, right? The community will recognize you. It's a way to succeed. Even if you may feel like you never succeed at school, here's a place where you can succeed. And it's a way to feel fulfilled. Some of your students may not feel like academics is for them, but the worlds that they see in video games, that's for them. So when we approach video games, I think we need a kind of broader perspective, not just all negative, but also to recognize what it's doing as technology for our kids, but how it's also kind of a source of hope and salvation, right? If we're going to talk about the gospel and Christianity and salvation and hope, then let's kind of frame video games in that kind of way as well, as an alternative to the Christian life. So let's start with this, because the last thing I want to do is give you arguments against your kids, right, playing video games. I want us to actually broaden our perspectives a little bit so that we can try to understand our kids a little better. I titled this, Why Kids Need to Play More Video Games, right? This is probably not the slide you were looking for. But here's why. Video games actually help to build strategic thinking, right? There are certain video games that help your kids exercise the intellectual habit of being strategic. It builds social networking and collaboration. They know how to network with people way better than we do, right? Especially since this is what they live and breathe. They have Discord, they have Twitter, they have all of these different kinds of game chat applications on their computers, on their phones, and they're able to communicate with people in ways that we could never have even dreamt of even 10, 15 years ago. And they're also able to build other intellectual habits such as creativity. There's a really popular game called Minecraft, where all you do is you just destroy blocks and rebuild other things with them. It's like Legos, but digital, right? But this is why I say this, is that if we look at video games purely as a negative thing, then we'll never be able to really understand why our kids like them to begin with, why our kids are drawn to video games. And if we think about it, what exactly is different between video games and Legos? Except the way that the technology is presented. And we'll talk about like all the addictive qualities as well, but I feel like that's a conversation that's best left not for us, but for your kids. So let's talk about peer pressure a little bit. So the pros and cons of community confronting video game addiction. So we often think that addiction to drugs, to pornography, to video games, to whatever, is a result of peer pressure, right? And that's yes and no, right? The answer to that is yes and no. Yes, peer pressure does happen in our schools, but it doesn't happen in the way that we think it happens. Most kids aren't being bullied into doing things, right? If anything, they're just being highly persuaded to do it because they're at a very developmental age where, you know, short-term stuff are more important than long-term, and the short-term benefit of being friends with other people is a big draw. And they kind of grow out of this a little later, college and beyond. But we have to recognize that, yes, peer pressure is important, but in a study that they did in South Korea following a bunch of students who had video game addiction, they asked the students what kind of pressures that they felt that drove them away or drove them towards video games and into their video game addiction. More often than not, it was not their friends at school. It was their families at home. It was their schoolwork. It was all the pressures, all the negative pressures of just not feeling like they quite belong that actually pushed them into video game addiction, right? So I think it's very easy for us to kind of blame like the kids who our kids associate with as kind of the foundation for why they're addicted to things, but oftentimes it's not just that. It's more holistic. It's a bunch of different factors. And being students who are in the AB high school system, I can't blame why they would escape into video games, seeing how much they work every single week. The kind of pressures that they might face, not just from their parents, but from their teachers, from their peers. But not just because the peers are like, oh, you're not cool for not playing this, but like, you're not as smart as I am, right? It's not because like the kids are saying, oh, you need to play more video games because that's how you're cool. It's more like they play video games because they found that their peers are telling them they're not smart enough. Well, if this doesn't work for me, then what else can I do? I actually talked to a student and I asked them, you know, exactly this. I won't mention the student's name because I don't think that would be appropriate. But I asked them, you know, why did they play so much, like several hours a day? And they told me, like, they don't like being with their family. They purposely just eat a little bit, and then they go up into a room because they don't want to have conversations. They don't like that relationship. Once their parents are asleep, they come back down, they go into a refrigerator, they eat as much as they can, and then they go back up, right? But that's the reality. And I said, oh, why else do you play video games? Well, I'm not that good at school, but I'm good at video games, right? I have recognition. And if I fail, I can just restart, right? And that might sound like it's lazy or that your kids don't want to take any responsibility for their failures. But if all they ever face is people telling them that you're failing, video games are the only place where they have any sense of control, where they can say, oh yeah, I failed, but no one's breathing down my back. I can just restart. So when we think about video games, we have to be very careful, right, On the one hand, we have to recognize that they are very addictive. They can be very addictive. Video game designers make these games to be addictive. Otherwise, they would earn nothing, right? So we have to be very careful about that, but we also have to recognize that there's a reason why your kids go to video games. And it's not just because their friends are telling them you're not cool if you don't play. Video games offer a certain hope and salvation, which kind of feeds into our addictive behavior. Our peers may introduce us to the games, just as they might introduce us to drugs, they might introduce us to sex or whatever it is, but it's often our family and school lives, often other things in our environment that can help fuel our need to escape. So let's watch this video together.
We don't really play games with our parents.
Oh, game playing.
Probably, maybe once a month.
Video games, I usually am like, no.
I haven't really played anything since the early 90s.
Once a week?
No, Dad. No.
Family learning. Let me think. When parents and kids get together to share experiences and explore the world together. My name is Sinem Seyhan. I'm an associate professor of educational technology and learning sciences at Cal State San Marcos. My gaming skills are average. Sorry, I just want to make sure that I can get some meat out of this cow. My current work is inspired by my experience as a child. Two parents are working long hours. They didn't have enough energy and time to play with me and my brother, and we didn't really get to spend time together. I try to play with my son as much as I can. I value playing games.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So for example, here we're exploring a farm and we're interacting with animals. And my son is learning what sound each animal makes. What does the sheep say? Yes. Engaging in play is important, whether it is digital or non-digital play. We invite parents and kids to play together. We're fortunate to have Alienware provide gaming laptops for our families.
What I find really interesting with Play to Connect, it helps families grow these shared values together. Hey, Sinem, how's it going?
It's going well. How are you?
I'm doing well. Did everything show up?
Yes, we have the laptops. They're ready to go.
I believe I am making positive impact through video games. One of the problems that I see is video games are framed as a context of conflict between parents and kids. What I'm trying to do is to show parents and kids that video games could be a context for togetherness, collaboration, problem solving. Hello everyone, welcome to our Play to Connect event. Thank you for coming. We're really excited to have you here.
The light one. Oh my gosh, look, you're stopping the waterfall.
All right, we're gonna have parents and kids switch.
Now you need to start capturing the animals in interspace.
Ah, put it in there again. I got it.
No, Dad. You build it on top of that.
All right, let's try to plant seeds and see what happens.
What is happening?
I have a plan.
What are we gonna do?
I have to create it myself.
We put some lights on, some more torches.
At home, I'm tutoring her. Now it's the other way around.
A few times I did big mistakes, like flooded our cornfields. Corn, oh, weeds, see? Did you enjoy the challenges?
Especially the chicken farm we made. Why does it have a skeleton in it?
It's a lot more fun than I thought. It was really interesting watching him at work.
There's just more value here than I think I had imagined, that it could be really good quality time. And I'm surprised at how patient he was with me.
You liked me doing it, and then you were telling me good job. That was cool.
It's really important that we shift the trend around video games and families and really start thinking about video games in terms of their potential to contribute to our lives. Yeah, that's the pig. Where's the pig?
Okay. So, by now, I hope that you all see this is probably not going where you might be thinking this is going, right? I really like that video because it teaches us one important thing, that really this is about us serving our kids and being with our kids, growing in relationship with our kids. I think it's very hard to deny that video games are part and parcel and are so intimately woven into our social fabric now, that if we as Christians want to be good witnesses to youth, like, we just have to understand video games and what they do. I just really like that video because it normalizes video games, because I think we often look at video games as kind of like these weird things that only our kids do, but we ourselves never really grew up on. So it's more of a place of addiction and negative things than anything positive. But the way that she kind of explained and how they showed in the video, that really if we think of video games as like just Legos, right? Toys. And you see the parents playing with the kids with their toys and helping them through these problems and helping them go through these solutions together. Like, this is part of what it means to live incarnationally as parents, to serve and to work with kids on a level that they understand. If it's not wrong for you to play Legos with your kids and help them build like these beautiful creative things, then how is it any more wrong for you to actually play a video game with your kids once in a while? I know that might sound really weird and sound really hard, but if you have young kids especially, and you know that they're like boys and that they will play video games eventually, not saying that girls don't play, the statistics say that there's a huge rise in the amount of girls that now play video games as well. Like, introduce them to video games in a healthy manner and set the pattern for which they should play video games in the future. If you're not teaching them how to play these things, then the world is. The same thing applies to like alcohol, right? Kids who have seen their parents drink responsibly tend to be kids who don't drink irresponsibly when they get to the age of 21. The same thing happens with a bunch of other things. We'll talk about sexuality next week. This is a topic that Asian Americans don't really touch. But you're afraid that your child will be sexually inappropriate in ways that you can't even imagine. You're afraid of what the world has to teach. But if you are the one who are their first contact, the one who is able to teach them from a very young age what sexuality from a Christian perspective looks like, you are setting the pattern for them for the rest of their lives. It really starts with you, right? But now, you also have a lot of parents who have kids who are relatively older. They haven't done that when they're young. How do you approach them? And I think part of it is just to swallow your pride and to try something even though it may be awkward, even though it might be weird, right? Don't do something drastic like saying, hey, I want to start playing video games with you on your level. Don't do that. They will see you as a complete embarrassment. But just ask them, watch YouTube from time to time, right? Watch the things that they watch. Ask questions, right? Even watch them play video games. Even if you're not over their shoulder, you notice them playing, just ask them, oh, what is that? What are you doing? What's the objective, right? And then as you grow, you can say, oh, wow, you're doing pretty well, right? Encourage them when they do well. So we have to be digitally incarnating now, which means that we have to be like Jesus in coming down to our youth in ways that we ourselves never imagined growing up. When we outright dismiss video games, we dismiss our youth. Like I said, these are their habits now. This is just part of the social fabric. This is just part of what they do and who they are. Video games are an undeniable part of our social fabric. I've said that multiple times. And when we refuse to learn and to play with them, we restrict our Christian witness. right? We restrict the opportunities that we have to actually talk to our youth about what it means to be a Christian in this world. Unless we want to argue that video games are inherently bad, I think that rejecting video games actually doesn't help the Christian witness at all, which the world already thinks of Christians as being totally irrelevant, right? Removing ourselves from another opportunity to be witnesses doesn't help overcome the stereotype that the world has. And even if you don't let your kids play games, right? Even if your kids don't play games, like, how are you going to be a witness to other youth who do? Because your kids are always in contact with other kids who do play video games. This is just to present, and I'll go through this real quick, but this is just to present kind of the future of where we're going with this, just so you have a heads up. There's a presidential candidate named Andrew Yang, and he's basically running on a platform that states that he wants to give, like, I think $1,000 to every American family every month, right? $1,000 a month. And the idea is that it's basic income, that everyone just gets a income to start with, whether or not you work. Regardless of what you think about that, we need to talk about this idea in connection to virtual reality and hedonism, which is like the pursuit of pleasure. Because some philosophers are now talking about a circumstance and a scenario that looks kind of like this. If humanity has a hard time living in the real world, but they're able to pick and choose and have as much fun as they want, have as much pleasure as they want in virtual reality, then why don't we try to aim to create a society where everyone's basic needs are met? We just all hook them up to a virtual reality set and they can just live as happy as they can be. That their only work is whatever work they want to do in video games. There's something a little fishy about that, right? Just thinking about it. It seems like total escapism, but for others it seems like the perfect solution. And I think the thing that we have to recognize is life is hard for your kids, even if you feel like it might not be as hard as it can be. Their perception is life is hard, work is exhausting, and they're bored. And I want to define this quickly. Boredom is a self-perceived lack of purpose, right? It's their perception of whether or not they feel fulfilled, whether or not they have purpose in their life. That's why giving them a bunch of things to do, be like, oh, you're just bored because you don't have things to do, actually doesn't solve the issue, because even if they have a bunch of things to do, none of those things give them purpose, and therefore they will always remain bored. But what I want you guys to recognize and to help instill in your kids is that escapism, in all of its ways, shapes, and forms, is hardly a remedy. And it's barely even a Band-Aid for the issues that we face. So some approaches to how we talk to our kids: don't be a cult. Teach truth, but be humble about it. Recognize that you yourself aren't 100% certain about everything, that you yourself are changing and becoming more like Jesus every day. And that's okay. We're not at the end yet. The second thing is we can't convince everyone, and that's also okay. So pray for your kids. Don't have this hope that your kids will, that there's this magical formula that will change your kids. There's not. The Lord has to do that. And that comes through prayer. Guide and serve, but don't, that's a typo, just don't force them to do anything, right? Discipline them, yes, but don't force them out of their will unless they're a danger or threat to themselves. Allow room for failure and space for recovery, right? Allow them to fail. Don't always go and pick them up or prevent them from failing. Let them fail. But when they do, don't just beat them down even more, but give grace and mercy and allow them to recover. Make Christianity something to be desired, not something to be escaped. This is really important. Don't just tell your youth to do Christian things. Explain why, and then help them visualize a world where these things are good. Visualization, imagination, creativity are so important. Let them imagine and be creative in picturing the kingdom of God. Right? Don't just tell them with words, but let them use their creative juices to see and picture it in their minds. And guide them to build habits incrementally, slowly, and to be satisfied with small steps. One thing before we go into Q&A that I will say is, escapism has many different forms, and it's not just video games, drugs, or sex. It's just as important to tell your kids, hey, I've seen you working for 8 hours straight. You need to go play. As it is to tell them, I've seen you play video games for 8 hours straight. You need to go work. How is it any different that work can also be, work itself is a form of escape. I know many people who bury themselves in work because they don't want to deal with the realities of life. They don't want to deal with their families. They don't want to deal with their kids. They don't want to deal with their failing marriages. So they bury themselves in work. And I think what we end up doing is if we tell our kids, stop playing video games, stop playing video games, stop playing video games, go work, go work, go work, we instill in the same kind of mentality. That when all else fails, that work is where you find your salvation. So I think in terms of escapism, in terms of building habits, in terms of finding identity, it's very important as parents and also the youth minister here to help guide them to a more holistic view of the Christian life. To help show them a vision and help them imagine a world where we can find hope and salvation in Christ and not in work or even video games, drugs, sex, whatever, you name it. And I think that's the key. So I'll just leave it open for just a few questions. We'll have a time for questions and answers.
So I have 4 years old and 6 years old. Can I just cut off video games, never let them play? I maybe push them to play sports, music, other stuff, and never play video games.
Mm-hmm.
Is that possible? Is this something I can do?
Is your question, is playing video games something you can do? Or
No. My question is that, can I cut off the video games from my 4 years and 6 years old, never let them play, just doing some other stuff?
Just cut video games out of your life?
Never video games.
Never? I'm trying to understand the question. Can you just get rid of video games in your life? Yeah, I think you can as an individual. It'll be very difficult if you're a student at AB, where technologically we're so connected. Like I said, it's part of that peer pressure in terms of playing with that group, because this is where you find a lot of your communities, right? You might have found your community in like music groups or all of these other things in previous years. But because of how much video games are part of our social fabric, it's very hard to avoid. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't unplug yourself from the internet. It's the same way you can get rid of Facebook or Twitter or all these social media apps. In fact, you could probably not play instruments or do anything if you really wanted to. But I think it's actually part of what it means to be a social being. God created us to be social. The means by which we are social differing. So I'm not sure if I'm exactly answering your question, but if your kids really wanted to disconnect from video games, I think they could. But I think that it would be difficult for more reasons than one. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for the topic. It's great discussion. I think here we talked multiple times. So I think a video game, one aspect I see that professor from Caltech State, I don't know if she has a study for the lifespan, because the way I observe that, just like the doctor now advise our young kids, say, don't use too much sugar, because then build pleasure, use a lot of sugar when they were young. When they grow up in the teenager, you cannot control it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing for the video game. I think my family has experience there. When they were young, we shouldn't really heavily introduce video game, because you don't want them to look for the source of pleasure and include that as one.
Mm-hmm.
And when they grow up, they can control themselves more. Like, I don't really respect Annie for the video game anymore, because she knows she can control. But when they were young means that elementary school, even junior high, depending on each kid's maturity level, if we don't help them, video games is fun. It's fun to me too. So we have to understand the kids gone through the development phase. Each phase, they have different level of control and maturity. And if you talk about neuroscience, they just don't have a nerve to do certain things at a young age. We cannot let that happen. We cannot really encourage them to play when they were too young. But some kids is better than others. Everybody's different. So we just have to watch. And the video game, I think, is different from Lego, is that Lego, they have to play with multiple body, when they were young, body parts. When they're young, it's very important to develop the, what do you call it, the capability to move things, coordination. Video games, you sit in there. The things you are practicing is your brain, only part of the cells, and also your fingers, and maybe your tips because you get excited, but nothing else. Okay, I'm not saying video games bad. In a controlled way, video games is good. But when kids are young, particularly elementary school kids, we don't want to let them to say, that's the escape place they should go. Because a lot of times people play video game not because they want to escape. It's just video games fun. So I think we've got to be careful. And when we get into the teenager stage, sometimes it's already too late, okay? And we have to accept it. I think all these methods is very, really good. You have to be patient. But one thing I think I also want to comment that, yes, Jesus came down to earth to show us he know everything we've gone through. But God knows that. I think Christian life is that says we have a limited bandwidth, we cannot experience everything. Like if we want to care for marijuana user, shall we just try marijuana by ourselves? Shall we be addicted to a marijuana before we say you shouldn't do it or help them? Or we disqualify ourselves to help those people? I don't have an answer to it. But I'm not going to go through that by myself. Okay? So it is a dilemma right now. I think a lot of social studies basically say you have to be them exactly. Otherwise, you're not qualified to even talk about. It is a dilemma. But I don't think that's the right way to go. It's more like a question than something else.
Yeah, well, actually, I don't know if we have too much time, but let me actually respond to that real quick. So if you play video games, there are actually a lot more fine motor skills that are required to play some of the more advanced games. But I think my major point is when we talk about video games, unless we want to argue that they are like marijuana, right? If that's how you view video games, then don't let your kids play video games at all, right? Why even give them smartphones where they can do that? Just give them, like, if that is the argument, right, then it doesn't matter what age they're at, because you'll always view it as marijuana or some other kind of hard addictive drug, right? I'm not saying marijuana is addictive, but if you put it into that kind of category. My major point is simply that if you think that video games are a okay form of entertainment that is fine to play, then I think that it's really the parents that should be the first to talk about it. Even if you don't introduce it to them until a later age, that's fine, right? But still talk about it. Find ways to have conversations about it. Set the patterns for what's the correct way to go. I think that's the key point that I really want to get across here, right? And the reason why I make that analogy between Legos and video games isn't so much to say like Legos are exactly like video games are exactly like Legos, but if we view video games as a opportunity and place where we ourselves can interact with our kids rather than seeing it as just what they do and what I don't want to be associated with, then we're inevitably going to create a space where there is this divide between us and the children. So, like I said, whatever your views are on what video games are, good or bad, I think you do have several options and choices laid before you to really consider and to take. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I will try to have some more time for questions and answers next week. And if you have questions about this, you can email me at akim@bmwvc.org, and I will respond to you. So don't be afraid. Yes? Yes, I can share slides. Yeah, I just need to figure out where to share those slides, but I can share those slides with you. Website? Okay. Yeah, I can do that. Okay, let's go ahead and pray real quick. Heavenly Father, I just thank you so much for just the time to be able to talk about a very important issue. Whatever our students are facing, whatever struggles they're going through, and even if we don't necessarily have all the answers, help us, Lord, to have wisdom to know how to approach these situations, and most importantly, Lord, give us love that we can humble ourselves to be servants of Christ by being ones who even serve our kids, even though that might seem like a really weird thing in our minds. But help us to be humble servants, because that's what you've called us to do. Help us to love and help us to build families and family lives that are honoring to you and to your gospel. So, Lord, I pray, teach us to love like you loved us in your Son. In his name, amen.